Alrighty. So, in terms of what you guys want to know, I thought we would start with the multiple choice section because I went over most of the essays in class today. I'll pick up the essays we didn't go over. I'll talk about it tomorrow. What questions do you guys have about the rest of it? There are 50 multiple choice questions, combination of matching and regular multiple choice, just like every other test. Matching typically is people and terms.
I have a question on Google. Like after bar, the grade, out of Google.
Okay, when you take a look at under the Rise of Nation States, Changes in Empires, those are the names from the class projects on absolutism. And so, if you need to take a look back at your class notes on those projects, the people that were not in your class, like Akbar the Great and Tokugawa weren't in every single class. So you would only be expected to know that and have a question in your task if that person was presented in your class. So we've got Louis XIV, everyone's responsible for because he was also in the textbook. Peter the Great, again, everyone's responsible for, he's in the textbook. We also had class presentations in some classes, but more importantly, he's in the textbook. Philip II, textbook, Armada, our movie, we had lots on Philip II. Elizabeth I, same thing, everyone's responsible for her. Frederick the Great, he's the one, he shows up in chapter 17, and I want to say he also shows up a little bit with like our Enlightenment, because he was one of those enlightened despots, but he's definitely in the textbook. Tokugawa is definitely one of the class presentations. So only if your class period had a presentation on Tokugawa would you expect to have a question about him on your midterm. I believe I lost. Yeah. All right. It looks like the photo story drive got cleaned out, so the presentations aren't there. I will see if I've got those presentations saved somewhere, and if I do, I'll upload them to Moodle. But really take a look at your notes. I'm not really going to be asking anything other than if it's a class presentation and the person wasn't named in a book, I wouldn't be asking anything other than kind of like what country were they from or what was their big symbol. That would pretty much what I'd be looking at. So like Tokugawa, what was his big symbol? The hollyhock leaves, the three of them. So that's the kind of question I'd be asking if it's solely a student presentation and he wasn't in a book. I'd be asking like what country is he from or what was his main symbol of absolute rule. I really wouldn't ask anything else. Okay? Montezuma, again, was a student presentation. Some of you had him, some of you didn't. Then you would not have a question about him on your midterm.
Wait, so you're doing the midterms like
per class. So basically, like the Tokugawa question, if you had Tokugawa but didn't have Montezuma, and another class had Montezuma but not Tokugawa, the Tokugawa question about the hollyhock leaves, I would remove that from yours, and for the Montezuma, for him, he was another Sun King. So we'd have the exact same type of question, but just different ruler, based on which one you had in your class. So it's not like I don't think it's a change in difficulty of question. It's the same question, just different ruler and obviously different symbol. Okay? Because I try to keep it as fair as possible but we did have different presentations on different rulers. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Same thing, Changxi, Qianlong. You probably had one or the other in your class. You may not have had either one of them because Tokugawa may have been the representative from the Asian region. Catherine the Great was in the textbook, so everyone's responsible for Catherine the Great. Suleiman the Magnificent was a student, but I kind of think every class had a Suleiman.
Yeah, I was still.
Yeah. We may not have. Suleiman was the lawgiver, the Magnificent. English Civil War, Rise of Constitutional Monarchy, in the textbook, and then we had that big PowerPoint where I went like step by step through it. The big thing about that is remember the people who were part of that Rise of Constitutional Monarchy. So we've already got Elizabeth I on there. You need to know Oliver Cromwell. You need to know the two Jameses, James I, then it was Charles I, then Charles II, James II. Remember the Jameses are on the ends, Charles in the middle. William and Mary for the Glorious Revolution. And you also need to remember the kind of periodization. The fact that you've got kind of like the Tudor time period, then the Stuarts come in, and then halfway through the Stuarts, Charles I's head gets cut off. You kind of at the end of the English Civil War, you get the time period of the Commonwealth, which only lasts for a few years. Then the Lord Protectorate comes in, Oliver Cromwell as dictator. When he dies, his son's only there for like another year or two. It goes away. We get the Stuarts back, which is the Restoration. Charles II first, then James II, and James II's only on the throne for like 2 years before he gets kicked off and is replaced with his daughter and her husband, William and Mary. And that's the Glorious Revolution. So if you remember, kind of, it got broken up into periods. And for that, the PowerPoint will give you the periods much better than the book. But here's a tip. When you're going through the PowerPoints, it's not necessary to look at the entire PowerPoint. What you want to do is you want to take a look at, okay, where are those kind of dividing slides where I have, the Commonwealth or the Glorious Revolution. So you know what's the order. And then you look for the slides that have the name of the person at the top. So you know, like, who are the important people. Beyond the people and beyond knowing what's the pattern, do you think I'm going to ask anything more specific than that? It's a midterm. I'm not asking you, like, on what battlefield did we capture Charles I? That's way too much detail. But am I going to ask, which of the 4 Stuart kings was beheaded at the end of the Civil War? Is that a question that probably would get asked? Yes. And what's the answer? Charles the First. So when you're going through PowerPoints, you want to look for, have I broken them up so that there's like sections to it? And if so, what are the names of the sections? Because those are probably important. And then you want to look for the people. All the rest of the other slides, ignore. With an exception. I have an exception in that particular PowerPoint. In that particular PowerPoint, we talked about several documents. The documents are important. So Magna Carta, the English Bill of Rights, those would be the 2 big ones. Because they form, the English Constitution isn't like our Constitution. It's not a single document. They've got several documents. But the 2 big ones are the Magna Carta that was signed all the way back in 1215. If you remember, that's the Robin Hood movie, Prince John. What was he, a lion or a fox in the movie? I think he was a lion and Robin Hood was the fox. But anyway, that Prince John becomes King John because Richard the Lionheart doesn't have any kids that can inherit the throne. And he's so bad, the nobility makes him sign this contract saying, all right, you now have to treat the nobles in a certain way. And the Magna Carta only applies to nobles. The English Bill of Rights applies to everyone. And the English Bill of Rights is what looks most similar to our Constitution and our Bill of Rights. So those are the two documents from the PowerPoint that I would kind of look at. And again, that's 2 slides. Only look at those slides. So the people, the slides that break up the time periods, and the 2 documents I mentioned. That's what I would expect you to know about the English Civil War and rise of the constitutional monarchy. Under Enlightenment, just above it with the philosophes and their ideas, that's that ABC Clio activity we did. So taking a look at Dennis Diderot, Rousseau, Locke, Hobbes, make sure you know those main ones. Yeah. I tend to like making people and the definition of terms matching.
Do you recommend going back into our chapter books and looking at what
Yes, I would. In the world history textbook, it's chapter 17 for absolutism, and I would recommend at the end of each section there are little questions at the end of each section, and what it has is recall, so identify and define. Those would more than likely be terms that would end up becoming matching. And the comprehension questions. It's a question, it's not a multiple choice, but these comprehension questions are very likely to be turned into a multiple choice question. So if you go through and you do recall and comprehension, and you look at all of those, more than likely you're going to pick up all of the matching terms. In the Strayer book, if you do that defining terms, that flashcard, that's the flashcard quiz, that's where they would be coming out of Strayer for names of people and definitions, is in that defining terms flashcard. I don't see it coming from anywhere else. I'm not pulling vocabulary out of PowerPoints. The vocabulary, the people, are all textbook. Yes. And remember, in Strayer, chapter 18, which is the Industrial Revolution, chapter 17 is Atlantic Revolution.
Were there any other chapters?
No. Strayer kept it all together. If we were in this book, we would have been going over like 5 different chapters. So that's why I like doing the Strayer. It kept it to a chapter for us. Though we'll probably be going back to this one for imperialism, because I kind of like how imperialism is laid out in this book better than that one.
Will taking the Strayer quizzes online help us prepare more test?
Yes. Just like with the unit test, where I took word for word, a number, like on the Industrial Revolution quiz, half of those questions were word for word from the practice quizzes, doing the exact same thing on the midterm. And all of my multiple choice questions, with the exception of the hollyhock leaf for Tokugawa, the sun for Montezuma, like the ones that are specific to the class project for absolutism, all the rest of them are coming out of the test bank for the 2 books. So I'm not changing the language from how it's presented in the textbook. So if you take the quiz, and even the world history textbook, there's a online phschool.com. In your book, it actually tells you how to log into it. there's like a little multiple choice quiz you can take on this chapter as well online. That I would go and I would take a look at it. The other thing that I think is helpful is, particularly with the Strayer website, when you go to it, it's not just the quizzes and the flashcards. It has a chapter outline where it's like it's taking the notes out of the book for you. I would take a look and read the chapter outline to help give you an idea of what were the important things to pull out of the textbook. That it may help you organize your notes to take a look at that chapter outline. Do you need me to scroll down? Or are we any more questions on this first part? That whole New Europe's portion, the migration, that's all the beginning of the absolutism PowerPoint, so you're really not going to find it elsewhere. It's kind of alluded to in the textbooks, but it's mostly a way of kind of bridging what you learned last year with how we started this year. So the migration, like Australia, New Zealand, those were convicts that started up those colonies. America, we had the indentured servants, and then later the slave trade. So looking at it, PowerPoint is where you're going to get most of it for that.
I have a question about, like, on the first page on the migration, you say the silver trade with China.
Remember, the silver trade with China was between Spain and China. And we talked about one of the reasons why Philip II in Spain had that economic decline was because they mined too much silver out of the New World, sold it to the Chinese, and what did the Chinese end up doing with the silver? Where did it go? Did it stay in circulation in China?
Oh no. You said they put it in the ground.
They buried it.
Yeah.
Yeah, they didn't break it, you know.
No, they buried the silver. So what happens to the value of silver? It went down because we had so much silver out there.
Yeah, but why would they put it in the ground?
It was their way of kind of banking it.
Just get a bank.
It didn't exist,
Yeah, we'll just
really.
put it in.
Anyway, the important thing about the silver trade with China is a lot of times we focus in on the Columbian Exchange being the exchange of goods and ideas between the New World Americas and the Old World Europe. Well, we also did have trade going on between the New World and China. How many of you like Szechuan food?
What kind of food?
Szechuan, like this really spicy Chinese that has a lot of peanuts in it. Are peanuts native to China?
No.
No. Where did they get peanuts? They got the peanuts from the Americas. They actually end up having a population. They get a population boom in China with the introduction of peanuts because it was a new protein source. So I threw the silver trade with China in just to remind you guys that the Columbian Exchange was not just Atlantic Ocean trade, that we also had the Indian Ocean combining with it. Okay? So the only thing that I would expect you to know about silver trade with China is China traded with Spain, and both of their economies tanked because too much silver was in the economy, in the market. There's nothing more specific than that about it. Other questions? Do you want me to scroll down? All right. Political revolutions, industrial revolution.
I don't know if that's the essay. Do we have that little notepad?
Yeah,
Give that to us?
no. Bring one in. If you don't have a 3-inch by 5-inch note card, you can always cut a sheet of paper to the dimensions. You get to write on both sides. 3 by 5 index card. So if you don't have one, feel free to make one. It doesn't have to actually be an index card. It could be a sheet of paper. You're allowed to write on both sides. You can have your thesis statement on it. You can have topic sentences on it. You can have bullet noted any evidence, information that you possibly want on it. The only thing you can't do is you cannot, in microscopic handwriting, write out your entire essay.
So it's just,
Good idea.
the note card is just for the essay.
The note card is just for the essay. When you come in, you're going to have your note card on your desk. After I hand out the multiple choice section, I'm going to come around, pick up all your note cards. They will actually be on my rolling cart all laid out. So when you turn in your multiple choice to me, you pick up your note card, sit down and write. If, once you finish your essay, you've still got time left on the clock and you want to come back and look at your multiple choice, you turn in your essay and note card to me, and I can hand you back your multiple choice. So when you make that decision to flip, it's not you're never going to see that multiple choice again. If you've got time, you're more than welcome to go back and look at it. Okay? Other questions? With the political revolutions, French versus American revolutions, really looking at what caused the American Revolution, what caused the French Revolution, what happened as a result. Obviously, the American Revolution, fairly successful. We had the little hiccup with the Articles of Confederation, but then we got it together with the Constitution, and we've been pretty stable ever since, with the exception of the Civil War. French Revolution, its attempt at democracy, not so hot. We have the Reign of Terror coming in. You've got waves to the French Revolution. Napoleon comes in like Caesar to try and calm everything down, and you end up going back to a dictatorship for a while. And then it's not until kind of later on that you finally kind of have a democracy set up post-Napoleon. So you want to know kind of like what are the differences between the two. In terms of multiple choice questions about that, I would possibly ask about, one of the big acts that made the Americans so upset. So like the Stamp Act, the Boston Tea Party, the Intolerables Act. So if you look at those political cartoons, what were the big kind of acts or events that we covered in those political cartoons that made Americans unhappy?
Wasn't also minorities came into the cities?
No, they came out of the cities. Well, wait.
That's Industrial Revolution later on.
But still, when the minorities came into the cities, the whites went out. And
That's white flight. That's part of urbanization, not American Revolution.
Yeah, so did I.
Yeah, that was the last page of the picture.
I know.
Yeah. Anyway, but that's urbanization. That's part of the Industrial Revolution. That happens to Detroit. That happens to New York City. It happens to a lot of big cities. But that's 100 years after we've become a nation that starts happening. In terms of American Revolution, it's like the Stamp Act, the Boston Tea Party, the Intolerables
So I believe
Act.
1700.
Yeah, it's 1700s, obviously. The French Revolution, you should know what are the different waves of the French Revolution and who was in charge of each wave. Like Robespierre was during the Reign of Terror, and you had the Jacobins. So that's where you really want to be kind of looking at people and vocabulary.
And he dropped his eyeglass.
Okay. If you're confused, one thing that I don't like about the Strayer book is they wait to the very end, and it has what's the significance, and it has names of people and whatnot. If you get confused about the French Revolution in terms of who is in charge when, chapter in this book, chapter 19 lays out the people very well. So if you want to look at your world history textbook, if you get confused about which person was when, because the French Revolution, we had the Strayer book, that had that short section, and then I went a little bit more in depth in the PowerPoint. But if you don't want to watch that PowerPoint movie again, or take a look at your notes, chapter 19 in your world history textbook has the names of all the people for the French Revolution. So this may just be an easier way for you to review the names of those people, rather than going back and watching that movie again. Okay, just as a hint. For the Latin American Revolution's goals and outcomes, I'm not holding you responsible for reading everyone's book.
Okay, that's what I was.
Yeah, no. I'm still in the process. The putting together of them didn't work out like I thought it would the first time around. So I'm still fussing with how to put them together. So, what you are responsible for are any of the countries that are mentioned in the Strayer reading about Latin American revolutions, and any of them that are listed in the Latin American PowerPoint that we went over. The Latin America Epilogue PowerPoint. There will be no questions taken directly from that PowerPoint. So you can mark that one off the list. The Latin America Epilogue PowerPoint, I will not take any questions directly from it, because remember, we didn't really go over it in class. It was there to help you guys write your epilogue. So while the majority of you actually looked at it, we did not go over it directly in class, so therefore mark that PowerPoint off. Same thing with the Revolutions PowerPoint. That one was accessed by you guys as part of your project. We did not directly go over it. Cross that one off. The only kind of Latin America PowerPoint you're looking at is the one that actually says Latin America PowerPoint, and we went over every single slide in class. Okay? So that's the one that talks about like Bolivar, Hidalgo, San Martin, Morales, those. That's what I'm looking for. So when we take a look at goals and outcomes, it's coming directly from the textbook. It's coming directly from that one PowerPoint. So you do not have to look at anyone else's books, and you are not responsible even for your own book in this case. Okay? So does that help kind of narrow down where you're looking for information on that one? Excellent.
You said that a lot about quizzes and tests and similar questions.
Yes.
Do you want to do that?
Yes, you are going to have more time in class to look at your old tasks. You're also more than welcome to come in during any free period. It does not matter if I'm teaching or not. If I'm teaching, we'll just stick a desk out in the hallway. You can look at it. If I'm not teaching, obviously, you can be in here. Period 5, I'm at the front door, so you just need to let me know before I leave to go up there that you want to do it, and I'll pull your folder. But you are going to have time, like literally every class period this week is all about exam prep, answering questions, helping you guys to organize. So, trying very hard to kind of pull everything back together, because it kind of, since I've been absent so much second quarter, got really disorganized. Trying to reorganize everything for you guys. Industrial Revolution, again, that's coming out of the Strayer book. My Industrial Revolution PowerPoint, forget the simulation because we put a pause on that, so you can X out Industrial Revolution simulation as one of the kind of sources of it. I'm really going to be focusing in on why was it that Europe, and in particular, why was it that Britain had the Industrial Revolution and not China. So that could be, I mean, it's one of your essay topics, but a question such as, like, why did, what aspect of Western Europe made it more likely that the Industrial Revolution happened there? And out of all of the choices, you see lots of close neighbor countries fostered innovation. That would be your answer. So just because something looks like it's an essay question, I can make multiple choice questions out of it. So you are going to have multiple choice questions about the Industrial Revolution regarding like why Britain, why Europe, the U.S., Russia / Soviet, because it did go over into once they became the Soviet Union, that comparison, Latin America, that's all out of the textbook. Out of my Industrial Revolution PowerPoint, it's taking a look at, that's where you bring in the urbanization. I could put, I could put a section from The Twilight of Dawn on the test and ask you, and ask you, no, the Twilight of Dawn is that poem by Charles Baudelaire that we read in class. It is not this. It's not the Stephanie Meyer Twilight series.
Yeah, I was like, what?
It sounds similar. I get it. But I could put a selection from the Twilight of Dawn or a selection from Mannahatta, which was Walt Whitman, and say, you know, after reading this excerpt, do you think that the author had a positive, a negative, a neutral opinion of the Industrial Revolution? And of course, Mannahatta was positive. Twilight of Dawn was negative.
Wait, I have a question.
But you would actually get. I wouldn't just ask you the question, was the Twilight of Dawn a positive or negative view? I would actually give you the excerpt. I would just take like a couple lines from it so that you don't necessarily have to remember the whole poem and what we talked about, but you would see on there and be like, oh, I remember that, and I remember us talking about the fact that it was negative. Okay.
But for the Industrial Revolution, why was it that China didn't go through it as much as it did?
Because China at the time period, while economically they were in the position, I mean, like they had lots of inventions and whatnot, there were no kind of like natural enemies of China at the time. They were very well protected. Whereas in Europe, you had a lot of countries that were kind of on the rise. They were all in competition with one another. And so the need to innovate in terms of the economy and in particular weaponry really kind of helped fuel the European Industrial Revolution. They had to compete with one another, whereas China didn't really have that competition, so they could just kind of relax. The other thing is, going back to that silver trade, after everything kind of collapsed with Spain, China was of the opinion, well, nothing ever good comes from dealing with Europe now, and they go into what we refer to as the Ming seclusion. And so they don't have a whole lot of contact with the outside world. One of the things about the Industrial Revolution is it's a lot of ideas coming from people from different countries bouncing off of one another. You don't have that happening in China. And so that lack of kind of drive to innovate and the lack of competition to innovate keeps them kind of where they were, mainly agricultural, and allows Europe to industrialize. It's that whole first section of the Strayer book.
Now they're like making all this stuff.
Because they're catching up. I mean, other than about the 200 years of where they kind of went into that seclusion, decided not to industrialize when Europe did, and then to the point where they were forced to, and we're going to see this in the next unit, deal with Great Britain, United States, other countries during the imperialism time period. With the exception of about like 200 years, China's been the top civilization with the most innovation, the most money, etc. I mean, historically, they're just reclaiming their spot right now of being top dog. So, but yeah, they're kind of getting there. Any other questions you guys can think of? Any help that I can give you just in terms of organization? Where do you need to look? I mean, literally almost all of it's coming from one of the two textbooks, with the exception of the English Constitutional Monarchy PowerPoint, the Latin America PowerPoint, the Industrial Revolution PowerPoint, and that first part about the migrations that comes out of the Absolutism PowerPoint. So really you've got 4 PowerPoints that you just need to pick and pull out the slides that have people's names on it, any kind of periodizations, any documents that we mentioned, and really that's it out of this PowerPoint. Since if you get the people, any comment about a kind of defined period of time in any document, those are literally the slides you need.
So what's like the main like portion of the test is like industrial
I will probably be a little out of the 50 questions. It probably will be a breakdown, if you will, where I will probably have kind of like 15 questions on absolutism, 15 on the revolutions, and then 20 on the Industrial Revolution, just because it's the closest in time. You guys only had a quiz on it, not a unit test. It may be like plus or minus a question on either side, but you can anticipate out of the 50 multiple choice, and that's including matching, which is 50 total, we'll do one side of the Scranton sheet, that it'll be around 15, 15, 20.
Or like absolute
And the political revolutions, with Industrial Revolution having the most.
You might have said this before, but I know that if you choose to do two essays, each one has to be double-sided. How long does if you choose one essay?
The one essay, you've got the same amount of paper. I would expect the one essay option, you've written front and back of one whole sheet, front of another, and you might have gone on to the back of that second sheet. But you certainly don't have to fill up the entire thing. With the two shorter essays, I'm really expecting you to fill up most of it, because you just, in order to structure, to have an introduction and conclusion, you're naturally going to have a little bit more writing. If you do the two shorter ones, introduction and conclusion can be about like 2 to 3 sentences. If you do the one big essay, I'm expecting like full intro and conclusion, which would be more like 4 to 5 sentences. But on the short essays, it's more than okay to shorten, just so that you've got enough space for your body paragraphs. Any other questions? Multiple choice, essay, either. I will be available all weekend via email and Facebook. You can also ask questions anytime. I'm not ending it. I'm just happy to say it while you guys are thinking about if there are other questions. Feel free to email me any questions you might have.
The migration, the forced migration, force of identity.
Yes.
Can you just explain the migration to places like South Africa?
All right. When we take a look at the migrations, I'm actually going to pull up the PowerPoint so we can go over.
Let's talk about the school. Maybe baseball player and stuff.
Oops. All right. So when we take a look at the migrations, we are on slide. We're on slide 5 here, in case you want to mark it down. Australia and New Zealand, these were the dumping grounds for your criminals. And you might remember that we said that earlier North American role, what colony in the U.S. was also a convict colony?
My mom's here, so.
Anyone remember which of the 13 colonies was a convict colony here in the U.S.?
I think it was Coco.
Wasn't Connecticut. Do you think it was New York?
Massachusetts.
No.
Rhode Island?
Wait, what's the first?
Which one was the convict colony? Where we you're getting close. Go further south.
Georgia.
Georgia was a convict colony. So, Australia, New Zealand, convict colonies. So, we call it forced migration because these convicts, we're not sending the murderers and the rapists there. We're sending the people that were in the debtors' prisons. So they had a debt, they couldn't pay it. And when you're in debtor's prison, you're actually just racking up more debt because you've got to pay for your food and you got to pay for like the bed that you sleep on at that. So this was a way for them to pay off that debt, and it was a good trade-off for the government because they got rid of some of their prison population. And when you send people to start up a colony, you're going to have a high death rate because you haven't set up proper sanitation and life is just rough. Well, I know it sounds cruel, but who would you rather risk? A whole bunch of prisoners who are just draining resources from your country, or do you want to send out your skilled workers? You send your prisoners. They set everything up. Things start to kind of calm down. We've got sanitation and whatnot. Then you send out your skilled workers that will be less likely to die. So this was a positive for the government to do this. So we talk about Australia and New Zealand. The next slide talks about the fact that the Aborigines in Australia, the Maori in New Zealand get pushed back just like the Native Americans do in the United States when we set up our colonies. South Africa is slide 7. All right. So with South Africa, the United States, we're not so much into the slave trade yet, but we do have what we refer to as indentured servitude. Do you guys remember that one? Indentured servitude. If you don't have the money to make it over to the New World, you sign a contract that says, if you pay for me to come over, I promise to work for you for X number of years. The more skilled you were, the less years you had to work. And so you were a servant, not quite a slave, because you still had rights, but you were a servant for a guaranteed number of years. Once your contract was up, that means you have repaid the cost of you coming over to America, and now you are free to find a job wherever you want to. Buy land, get yourself set up as a free man. You're not a slave for the rest of your life. So that's why indentured servitude is slightly different than slavery. You tended to be treated better, and it was a defined time period. So with migration to places like South Africa, the United States, you see indentured servitude as a way for someone who is in the lower class to go to a place where they can actually follow what we refer to as the American dream, where they could potentially get out of the lower class and maybe make it up to the middle class. And the reason why we take over South Africa was to improve and cut down the transportation time between India, where we have all of our spices, and Great Britain, where everyone likes to eat said spices. Yeah, if any of you have ever had British curry, way spicier than like Indian curry. The British like their spices. So does that answer your question, Henry?
Yeah.
Okay.
So was South Africa controlled by the British? Or
The
Dutch last?
No, the Dutch were first.
And then the British took over.
Then the British took over, and that was the. You don't need to know for this. It was the Boer War. We'll talk about it again when we get into imperialism.
Okay.
But just know that the Dutch were there. Then the British took over, and the British wanted it not only to get that transportation cut down to India, but also we're going to see the British and the French really fight over all countries in Africa. And it was kind of like a chess match, where the French would get a country and then the British would come in and get the country next to it to stop the French from being able to get a whole big area.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll actually have Africa on the floor, and we'll scramble for it. We call it the Scramble for Africa. Any other questions that you guys have?
Do you recommend the Strayer website, the Strayer book, ratings that you have?
Yeah, I would go back through your readings. What I would do is I would actually go to the 2 book websites, take their quizzes, find out where you're missing something, find out what questions you're getting wrong, and then go back into the book to find those answers. Same thing with the defining terms. At the end of each section in the world history textbook, do that, recall, identify. If you can't find the answer to it, that's when you go back into the textbook. I think rereading the chapters as a whole, I don't think is particularly helpful. because you guys know a lot of the information. You're just trying to kind of refresh your memory. It's better for you to take those quizzes, find out where you still have the holes, and then really go in and reread those particular sections rather than the whole thing. Unless you tend to find that you have an easier time just rereading and retaining it. The other thing is, if you do well with memory devices, you know, if you're in music, you probably know the "Every Good Boy Deserves Fudge" to recall what the lines are on the, what is it, the treble clef scale. It's been so long since I played piano or violin, but I just remember for one of them, "Every Good Boy Deserves Fudge" and "face" are the spaces in between the lines. If you're good with memory devices like that, remember when I give you the test, write down anything that you're trying to remember in the margins of the test before you actually look at the test. Anything you're afraid that you're going to not remember, write it down quickly before you even look at a single question. That test is there for you to scribble on, make notes on, whatever you need it to be. Just hurriedly write it down before you even start taking a question. For those of you who also get maybe a little sidetracked, and I'm going to be very gender specific here. Girls typically, we like to kind of read into multiple choice questions and give all sorts of shades of gray, and then we hem and haw over what the answer is. And sometimes boys will do it, and sometimes girls don't. But if you tend to be someone who hems and haws, you might want to take your sheets of paper, because they're going to be on your desk anyway, for your essay, and block off so you're only looking at one question at a time. If you block it off, you tend to focus in on that question more. And you don't kind of start thinking about, well, if this answer, maybe that one. And look at the answer choices as true false statements. If the statement just by itself is false, and I'm not looking for a false statement, so there's like no, the question above doesn't have like not or accepted. If it's false, then it can't possibly be an answer. So just mark it off. And I would visually like take your pen and literally mark through that selection so that you don't even think about it anymore. I think that people who succeed on multiple choice questions, their tests look messy because they're physically marking off, that's not possible, that's not possible. It sometimes helps you to kind of like focus in on what the answer is, especially if you're kind of caught between two. My other suggestion for you is, when you're studying, do not wait and study for like 4 hours the night before our midterm. You'd be surprised at the number of people who do that. I would probably study for about half an hour every night between now and our midterm. The night before, you maybe want to do an hour just to kind of refresh, especially if we're later on in the week and you've taken like 4 midterms before that. But take like a half an hour each night tonight, half an hour over the weekends, to just kind of review. Because in short bursts like that over a longer period of time, you're more likely to remember than if you just do like 4 hours. Like your brain just can't handle all that information. So do it in short bursts. And again, if you have any questions that pop up between now and then, send me an email. I'm certainly going to be online this weekend responding to emails. I'm also on Facebook. I know some of you have friended me on Facebook, so I respond to Facebook requests as well. Do not contact me because you think it's a stupid question. Contact me. Any question. Essay or midterm, like the multiple choice. Anything else?
I don't know.
Yeah.
The plantation stuff.
All right, the plantation system, that's the... Let me just wait for everyone to calm down. With the plantation system, that's the slave trade. So when we think about that triangle trade between Europe that gets the rum, Africa where we take the slaves from, the slaves come down to the Americas where we have the sugar plantations that then you take the sugar you make it into the rum. So when we take a look at that plantation system, that economic system is what helps fuel the United States and fuels not just their independence, but their ability to become a world player when we come out to the Industrial Revolution. Is that homework for me?
Yes, this is the urbanization essay.
Yep.
And this is the timeline, but the paragraphs are done, but I haven't.
Just bring them to me tomorrow.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So if I were to ask a question about the plantation system, it could be something along the lines of slaves were brought over to work on this type of plantation, or all of the following plantations except, and I would put like cotton, tobacco, sugar, and pineapple. Well, which one did they not work on? Pineapple, because we didn't have Hawaii yet. So it would be something along those lines.
Okay. And which products came from which of the triangle trade?
All right, so sugar, the sugar was made down kind of like in the Caribbean. More often than not, the rum was manufactured in the United States, sent to Great Britain, and Great Britain's kind of contribution was to pick up the slaves from the coast of Western Africa to bring down to the Caribbean to work on the sugar plantations. We refer to it as triangle trade, but it's not really a triangle shape.
Okay. Alright.
Okay?
Makes sense.
All right. And feel free to email me with any further questions.